Why are we so divided? Is there any value in having political discussions? Hi, I'm Bob Graves, and this is Living with Wisdom. First, I want to address our division, then afterwards I will discuss the value in our discussions. We are lost in a broken system. Why is it that so many people can clearly see a depth of corruption on the other side of the political aisle, but they simply cannot allow themselves to see the depth of corruption on their own side? Well, not everyone is that extreme. Oh, perhaps several can admit to some isolated corruption on their side or concede some genuine integrity on the other side. Nonetheless, we seem to be largely oblivious to the employment of differing weights when assessing potential corruption in both major parties. When I critique the right side, or what Trump or McConnell are doing, what do I typically get from the right? Trump did nothing wrong. What about Hillary? What about Biden? What about Obama? However, if I critique the left side, or what Pelosi or Hillary or Schumer or Perez are saying or doing, what do I get? False equivalency, Bob. False equivalency. There is the occasional person who does see me as an equal opportunity political critic, but what do I often get from them? All you can do is criticize. Don't you believe in anybody? Well, to be sure, both sides also see corruption on the other side where it does not exist. They conflate differences of opinion with evil. And this adds the complexity to discussing the issues. And so unfounded accusations do abound. But I would argue that both sides also use unfounded accusations as justification for refusing to consider legitimate concerns. There seems to be a genuine disbelief that we are living in a systemic breakdown. A breakdown that stretches across the entire political spectrum. It cannot be admitted that corruption is that widespread. Too many need to believe the corruption is mostly over there on the other side of the aisle. It is as if our society has a mob cognitive disorder of splitting. Now, I'm using the word splitting to talk about the human ability to have two contradictory ideas without realizing they are a contradiction. So, what causes this splitting? Half of our minds desperately need a hero to worship. And half of our minds desperately need enemies to blame. Both needs are maladaptive and out of balance, but few people can see that, and so our standards of judgment are biased towards our heroes and against our enemies. But rarely do we realize that our heuristics of evaluation use contradictory standards. When judging the other side of the aisle, we can ask ourselves, is there any way that I can see them as corrupt? If so, I need no other explanation. But when judging our side of the aisle, we ask ourselves, do I have to see them as corrupt? Perhaps I can embrace what sounds like a better explanation. True it is that both sides of the aisle subscribe to different philosophies and value systems. That's fine. And they develop a different hierarchy to their moral matrix, and therefore they exhibit in some ways very different concepts of what constitutes success or failings. But they are both suffering from the exact same human insecurities and traumas. They are just maladaptively dealing with their denial of inadequacy and insecurity with different philosophically distorted filters. It reminds me of the splitting associated with the Madonna whore complex, where some heterosexual men cannot be sexually attracted to women of character, but cannot love and respect the women they desire. It is almost as if we cannot conceive of all politicians as possessing the full set of human nature together with its acquired developmental strengths and weaknesses. So, we cannot allow ourselves to be honest about the shortcomings within our own political party as we simultaneously overstate its integrity. This is not just an error in thinking. It is backed by strong emotional fear. To be more balanced and honest would most likely cause us to lose all hope. And so we cannot be honest about the legitimate concerns of the other party. After all, how can one make a deal with the devil and prosper in such desperately trying times? Oh, of course, we usually do our best to keep from sounding overly dramatic. We must, after all, sound rational when we can, from time to time. As but one example, the calloused indifference that indulges the artificial need to control women's bodies, in my opinion, is just as indefensible and just as violating as the alleged women's right to an abortion. There is little to no empathy for the woman dealing with a very tough situation or medical condition, and little to no awareness of a sanctified boundary with the mystery of humanity developing in the implanted fetus. Instead of seeing this as a truly difficult conundrum, where the solution is not at all simple, we reduce it to an artificial morality of black and white, where we pretend the solution is always and only in one extreme direction. We cannot allow ourselves to find a balance. No. A balance needs to be seen as the slippery slope towards evil. Now, I started out by asking, why is it? My working theory is that it isn't entirely our own fault. Yes, there are a number of bad apples spread out among us all, on both sides. But I believe most people are simply trying to do what they honestly believe to be the right thing. We live in stressful times. We can't quite figure out what stresses are helpful and what stresses are harmful, and we disagree. We pay more attention to the stresses we wish we didn't have. And so, rather than face societal problems squarely, we take an easier path and embrace a tribal philosophical loyalty. And when we defer to the charm of our leadership. But leadership is often just as lost as we are. They're in the stress as well. And so they get seduced by the donor owners in the oligarchy, without whom they cannot raise sufficient money to get elected. And as much as I don't like the oligarchy, they too are just trying to keep from losing what they believe they have justly gained. Every single one of us, from the top to the bottom, are born into a challenge. And for many of us, that challenge seems overwhelming at times. And so we have failed to develop a true and solid belief in both ourselves and others. We have entered survival mode. And so we pick our tribes for security and use our brains, not to think fairly, but to rationalize our loyalties as we let an imperfect system run its course. But rather than change the system that seduces all of us in different ways, we tweak it to our advantage and demonize the other tribe's tweaks while allowing the system to merely continue running its malfunctioning course. As for myself, I cannot justify many of the decisions acted on by Trump or Pelosi or McConnell or Schumer. And to be honest, I struggle with my own decisions and actions. But really, given the level of stress, the degree of common traumas, our maladjusted driving needs, and a broken system, what else should we expect? So although I hold us responsible for fixing the broken system, I blame the system more than I blame us for the resulting problems. We are not the enemy. It is a broken system that is destroying and dividing us. We need a new zeitgeist. We will only find it together. Now, I turn to the value of the discussion and the political chatter, or the missing value. In my opinion, the quality of thought is all up and down the excellence continuum. We have access, if we want it, to numerous professional journalists, as well as an unending supply of citizens on social media. So there certainly is no shortage of political chatter. Some of these people engaging in the discussion are very well informed, while others are aware of little more than sound bites, if even that. And this range of rigor, or lack thereof, is not distinguished by what side of the aisle the comments are coming from, or even how generally intelligent the commenter might be. There are plenty of astute conservatives, plenty of astute liberals, and plenty of astute independents not really loyal to either side. And almost all commentators out there are pretty sure that they are one of them. It is rare that those speaking up think themselves ill-informed or mistaken. I'm not immune to this perspective. I have questions and opinions that have been described by many others as my not-so-humble, not-so-well-informed opinion. And I hope to get you to consider that this political chatter makes some difference, but in the end, at this particular moment in history, it makes very little difference. Can an argument be made that I am overreacting, or is there some validity to my concern? Well, I will try to make this as bipartisan as possible. In this discussion, I do not want to take sides as much as I want to examine the process of political chatter, but to be sure, I do have my own opinions. So, what do I see as problematic? First, most people are not really listening to anything other than their own sides. Now, I do not mean that no one hears things from other tribes. Rather, most people give the huge bulk of their attention to their own side. And if they are aware of anything coming from the other side, it is short little snippets shared by commentators who use those snippets to discuss how ridiculous the other side is. In other words, for both liberals and conservatives, most of what they know about the other tribe is through the filtered comments coming from their own side. In today's social media, we all have access to a wide variety of opinions, but no matter, we do not avail ourselves to truly consider the spectrum. If, for example, I had something to say that had a potential to change your mind about an issue or two, but you already have a vague negative idea where I stand on other issues, well, it's very likely that you will not take me seriously. And if you do read or listen to me, you will most likely not pay attention to the development of my argument. Instead, you will listen for small isolated statements that you feel confident you can use to dismiss me as a useful idiot. When I speak about specific positions on specific issues, my audience is significantly made up of those who already agree with me and who are looking for even more ammunition to bolster our common opinion. Does that really make a difference? Hardly. Does it matter how correct or incorrect I might be? No, not really. If we already agree in our politics, I might seem brilliant to you if I can use big words, refrain from swearing, or simply sound educated. But if we disagree, you will look for evidence as to where am I purchasing my Kool-Aid? The net gain is at best insignificant, and at worst, I might even lose you because even like-minded people do on occasion disagree. So if I am correct in saying that for the most part people of differing opinions are not actually listening to each other, then it could be that our chatter has only an insignificant impact. Second problem is that of sources. News organizations are anything but. The major sources of news belong to huge conglomerates with cable TV and hundreds upon hundreds of channels, with newspapers, television, and radio stations in abundant supply all over America. It might surprise you to know that 95% of all of those sources are owned by just 6 huge corporations. And those corporations are involved in much more than just news. So, can we be sure that they will report news that could hurt their other corporate conflict of interests? Well, as but one example, Disney. Disney owns ABC, 80% of ESPN, Touchstone Pictures, Marvel. They own Lucasfilm, Fox Entertainment Group, 50% of A&E, 50% of the History Channel, 50% of Lifetime. They also own Pixar, Hollywood Records, 10% of Vice Media, and Core Publishing. And that's just a partial list. What's more, those corporations also own various other corporations numbering in the hundreds, both inside the USA and in foreign countries. Many that are engaged in local and regional news. The vast number of local radio and television stations in the United States are not actually locally owned. And some that claim to be locally owned are owned by a local corporation that in turn is actually owned by a national corporation. So locally owned, even when true, does not always mean what you think it means. Now, we can certainly differ on how and to what degree this filters the spin on political news that we have access to. But it strains credibility to think that this would have no impact. No doubt the impact varies from place to place, but we have a string of journalists who, upon criticizing the party line inside their news organization, found themselves quickly without a job when exposing inconsistencies. Usually, only a few at the top of the heap can get away with it. As of the day I was busy preparing for this discussion, 3 websites that I knew about that maintained lists of journalists who were fired for telling the truth no longer exist. And one such website had a suspended notice when I got to their still active URL. Sad to say, the day I was preparing for this discussion, I could not find one active website still in existence that had such a list of journalists fired for telling the truth. Well, just off the top of my head from previous research, Phil Donahue objected to the pro-Iraq war attitudes on MSNBC and was quickly let go. And it was later leaked that Chris Matthews was influential in that decision. Bill Moyers was pressured into silence for his anti-Iraq comments, but managed to keep his job. The chances of being fired from your job at a major news outlet goes way up when you disagree with the political posture of the owning corporation. And it is common for fired journalists to assert that afterwards, that talking points were distributed daily about what attitudes and positions were to be pushed that day. We even saw from some of the emails published by WikiLeaks that MSNBC was receiving directives from the DNC about how to change their narratives. And on the other side of the aisle, Fox News might criticize certain Republicans, but they still remain the major talking source for points coming from the RNC. How can we trust news organizations that are so huge where the owners of the news organizations have definite political concerns on one side or the other? And even if we are aware of fact-checking, we have fact-checking organizations, we discovered that they too can have a bias. But the general gist is that it makes no difference what side of the aisle a particular news outlet might be on. Fact-checking in American journalism is telling us a very sad story. But we also have a number of small independent news organizations available on either YouTube or low-traffic websites or featured on low-powered community radio stations. And these organizations are also usually identifiable as being largely on one side of the aisle or the other. But they are often a splinter group who are at war with the hypocrisy on their own side of the aisle. I suppose that is helpful, but they do not have the money or the outreach that the major news sources have. And those that still have obtained excellent facilities are nonetheless not heavily trafficked. The vast majority of independent news sources on the internet are made up of just one person in front of a camera and microphone pushing up episodes on a YouTube channel. These independent commentators do not have the personnel or the finances to get their views out to a major portion of the general public. So, given the limitations, even when news organizations are truly dedicated to giving us the unvarnished truth, they do not have the time or space or the resources to make a thoroughly compelling case. At best, all they can accomplish is to rally the choir of people who already agree and inadvertently offer the incomplete information that emboldens the opposition to quickly conclude, well, if that is all they have to offer me, then obviously they are wrong and I am right. We also have some foreign news outlets in the United States like Al Jazeera, Telesur English, and Russia Today. And many who see their work are unaware of the fact that AJ Plus is actually Al Jazeera, or that RT is actually Russia Today. But this is not necessarily a problem on its face. It is not as if foreign news organizations are incapable of delivering truthful news. But how do they rank on fact-checking? From my experience, as it turns out, foreign news organizations can be just as fact-troubled reporting about their own countries as American news is. Well, however, sad to say that when foreign news organizations report on events going on in the USA, they do come out far better. What? Yeah, and that is terrible news. When foreign news sources criticize U.S. policies or report on U.S. issues, they tend to be more accurate when fact-checked. But in our McCarthyism and other phobias, it is easy for U.S. sources to simply dismiss them as propaganda sites. True it is that they are very critical of the U.S. at times, and they are not writing stories about our best features. But as it turns out, they are exposing the indelicate side that most of our news organizations simply lack the courage and integrity to touch. Or if they do, they will offer a cleaned-up version of the story so as to not seem too anti-American. They have to wait for a complaint to become trendy. And if they tread too far, they will get accused of being a foreign asset. And lastly, most of the news we get comes from a source that has very little choice but to deal with the issues in an overly simplistic manner. To truly understand, for example, what is going on in Latin America would require hours of information, equivalent to reading several books from several different points of view, hearing them all, and then hearing the rebuttals extensively. But no one has time for that. If what will appear in the news cannot be reduced to a daily column or a sound bite, sorry, you're just not going to get it. And when the research experts do have something to say in a sound bite, if you do not like what you hear, well, you can simply dismiss it as insubstantive. And you are correct. There is a lack of substance offered. But that does not mean that the substance does not exist if it could be given the time and space. 95% of the news we get is an insufficient reductionism of mere summaries with too little substance to actually persuade anyone to change their mind. News does not inform us. It serves the purpose of soothing us into believing our side was right all along. Regardless of what the truth may be, I would argue that the general state of affairs in the United States is that we simply do not have a news environment that informs the bulk of Americans about political matters. This makes it very difficult to have fruitful political discussions. It makes little difference what side of the aisle you are on, or which side you resonate with. What Samuel Clemens said years ago is just as true today. He said, if you don't read the newspaper, you are uninformed. If you do read the newspaper, you are misinformed. Not that it matters. Americans have very little respect for any political opinion they do not hold. Everyone is an expert without regard to how rigorous they have researched a matter, even if they have no clue how to go about doing the research. So I conclude that there is some value in expressing a political opinion, but that turns out to be minuscule. And I see the division between us as an inevitable consequence of a broken political system. I'm Bob Graves. Thanks for listening.